So when I was 19, I made a movie. More specifically, I made a Scream movie. Just without Ghostface, scary phone calls. Basically, it lacked everything that makes Scream so great. What it did have, though, was a cast of good-looking teens, a scary killer with a white mask, a final girl, and he used a buck knife to hunt his victims with. So, essentially the same thing. This movie, which I titled Rival, was supposed to be a test for myself. I had just finished making my first professional short film, and I wanted to put all my eggs into one very fragile basket and make my first feature. This is around 2022 when the pandemic was starting to slow down, and I had just graduated high school the year before. At the time, I was operating under this belief that filmmaking and making movies was my quote-unquote destiny. There was no other way for my life to pan out. So, ready to move on to my next big project, I took the storyline from one of my fan films I made when I was a senior in high school. It was just a Scream fan film, by the way, and just decided to axe Ghostface from the script and then call it original because I still had the intention to make money with it. But the reality was, Rival was a Scream fan film no matter which way I tried to spin it. The premise followed the familiar Scream formula where the killer stalks one final girl and then slowly kills her friends one by one while they try to figure out who he is behind the mask. The only difference between my movie and the Scream movies is that I revealed the killer for the first 10 minutes of the movie. So essentially, you follow him throughout the runtime while he runs around killing the final girl's best friends, and they stupidly try to figure out who he is when literally every single possible sign is pointing to this man. You could tell it was written by a 19-year-old. The truth is, Rival was always destined to fail, but my narcissistic optimism got the best of me and I went full steam ahead. So when everything started to go wrong that felt like it could go wrong, I began to spiral. As of now, Rival sits at a 3.5 out of 10 stars on IMDb, and Letterboxd, I think it's around like 2 out of 5. I think that might be the average, but I'm pretty sure it's lower. Or let me check. Oh, not enough people have reviewed it to have like an official rating, but it looks like it's around 2 out of 5. There's this one review of Rival that I saw on Letterboxd the other day where it said that the movie essentially boiled down to an ancient battle between a toxic twink and a loud non-binary lesbian. I wish I could say the reviewer was being overdramatic, but it's painfully accurate. Honestly though, I'm actually really grateful for everyone who left a review on the movie, regardless of whether it was negative or positive. Even the really negative ones noticed aspects of the movie that I honestly would have never even noticed myself unless they pointed it out. Of course, there were also those few really mean-spirited reviews that attacked me personally as a person for making the movie. There are even some that compared my movie to big Hollywood budget movies that were released around the same time, like Evil Dead Rise, which, let me mind you, Rival is a no-budget movie. But I'll take it as a compliment. Clearly, there was something in the production that they were like, yeah, multi-million-dollar movie and a no-budget movie. Absolutely. Now, I just want to shift gears really quick and just talk about the title of the video. I know you've read it and thought I'm probably being super overdramatic because there's no way that his feature film ruined his life. He made a feature film. Like, that is something that a lot of people don't really have the privilege to do, and I'm very grateful that I did. But if I'm being totally honest, around the time while I was making this movie, it genuinely felt like it was ruining my life. Let me explain. From dealing with on-set drama to losing some of my real-life friends to actually being involved in a real-life murder case, the movie took a toll on me. It pushed me to a point where I started to question whether I was actually cut out for this industry. I actually questioned whether I actually had the talent to be a filmmaker. And yet, despite all of that, I can confidently say that I'm grateful for the experience. Because as traumatizing as certain moments were, I can look back on it as one of the happiest parts of my life. Because at the end of the day, filmmaking is what I love, and the years I spent away from it made me realize and reevaluate why I fell in love with it in the first place. That being said, I do want to warn you. This video is going to touch on some heavy topics like depression, mental health, and real-life murder, so if you're not feeling up to that, feel free to click away. I'm not going to take it personally, and I completely understand. But I will do my best to keep it as lighthearted as possible, because as dark as these moments were, I felt like they were necessary to get to the other side. Maybe not the murder. That definitely wasn't necessary. But everything else I'm going to talk about in this video was. Instead of giving you this long story about what happened from beginning to end, I feel like it's more important to break it down into small sections and tell you the biggest lessons that I learned while making this movie. That first lesson that we're going to talk about today is learning how to invest in the right people, understanding their intentions, and learning how they act in situations of conflict. Like I'd already mentioned, a year before filming Rival, I'd just finished making my first big budget short film, Cackle. Because up until then, all of my projects projects had been fan films that I was posting on YouTube. But Cackle was different, because it had a big budget and an actual crew that I hired. Even though the majority of that crew still made up a bunch of my friends that I'd worked with previously, it still felt legit to me. These friends were people that I'd known since high school. And while working with these friends worked on my passion projects and content that I made for YouTube years before, I wasn't prepared for how it would translate onto a big budget professional set. Issues definitely came up during filming, but I was so caught up in being able to direct a professional set that I totally let those issues slide right over my head. I brushed those problems aside, and it felt like those positives heavily outweighed the negatives. So when it came to making Rival, I hired pretty much all of that same crew. I also ended up hiring seasoned professionals who have worked several decades in the film industry. Now, before I delve any deeper, I just want to preface this and say that this isn't me trying to blame anyone for anything that went wrong. At the end of the day, I was the director, and I was responsible for not only how things ran, but the general vibe on set. As far as I knew, this is also my crew's first time working on a production this scale, with the exception of those seasoned professionals that I mentioned. And while that doesn't automatically mean things were doomed from the start, it does mean that none of us were truly prepared for what was coming. Looking back, there were definitely moments where I should have handled things differently. A lot of these situations honestly shouldn't have even happened in the first place. And in those moments where things went wrong, instead of collaborating with each other, I noticed a lot of my friends that I'd worked with previously would turn to the other cast and crewmates and start pointing fingers and talking about them behind their back. This is especially bad on our late night shoots because we would start filming from the second it got dark to early in the morning. Tensions were high, people were exhausted, and you can feel that frustration boiling over in ways that it probably shouldn't have. Thankfully, the more seasoned and professional cast and crew had the trust in me and the experience to come up to me and approach me and talk to me directly whenever they felt like there was a problem. We'd talk it through, find a solution, and we'd move on. But with my friends, on the other hand, it was a totally different situation. And when I say situations, I don't mean like catastrophic, massive production failures. I mean like small disagreements. There was this one night in particular that stands out. We were filming really late. Someone came up with an idea that I ended up saying no to because it would involve a prop that we just didn't have at the moment. We are already over time for how long we were scheduled to be at this location that I was renting, so figuring out the way to implement this idea would have taken more time, which meant more money out of my pocket. And while again, this idea I thought was honestly great and I would have loved to see it, I explained to them that we just didn't have the time or the resources to do it, and I told them no. The time we were wasting was frustrating not only me, but everybody else on the cast and crew. So eventually I did what I felt was best in the moment, and I started to ignore my friend. I continued on with the scene and continued shooting, pretending like I didn't hear them, because ultimately he wouldn't take no for an answer. And of course that led to a lot of tension in the coming days. While I understood that he was upset because he felt ignored and disrespected, I honestly felt betrayed as well. I paid them to be a part of a team where I believed we could work together over any disagreements, but unfortunately that just wasn't the case. And it was then that I started to realize the difference between my friends who I had hired because I'd worked with them previously and the more seasoned professional cast and crew that had been doing this for a long time. Because whenever they'd pitch an idea and I'd say no, my explanation was good enough for them. But my friends, on the other hand, whose opinions I honestly valued more than anybody else's because I'd worked with them for so long, didn't feel that way. Thinking back on it though, I can't say I'm blameless because there are definitely moments where I dropped the ball and didn't make the right calls. Take the final scene for example. In the script, it was written that Gregory Arroyo's character, who plays the dad of Aaron and Gail, to be wheeled out on a gurney and into an ambulance. But up until the day before we were supposed to be filming that scene, I had no gurney and no ambulance, basically nothing to actually film the scene the way it was written. I'd convinced myself that my guerrilla filmmaking skills would come back to me and I'd figure it out as I went. Obviously that didn't happen. The day before we were supposed to film that scene, Greg essentially spent the entire day building his own makeshift gurney. I'm not kidding. He used plywood and the door to his own kitchen pantry to make that gurney. And honestly, it just goes to show the lengths that people are willing to go when they're that dedicated. Why do I keep saying dedicated? When they're that dedicated to their craft. And instead of pointing fingers or blaming anyone, he figured out a way to make it work. And even though it doesn't look 100% the best on film, it's honestly my least favorite scene in the movie, and it's why I cut it out in the director's cut. But we still made it work. And it just highlighted one of the best parts of filmmaking that I love. Even though I was responsible for making the situation happen, we found another way to make it work. It also made me realize just how essential every member of the crew is. Coming from my fan film days where I was used to taking on the work of multiple crews behind the camera, I assumed it would work out this time when I was working on this movie, but ultimately I stressed out a lot of people. It was a hard lesson in the value of pre-production and just how crucial proper planning and preparation really are. Actually, we're just gonna pause for a second because my food just got here, so we're gonna take a quick break. I'll be back. I'm back. Where the fuck was... Oh, back to where I was. So by the time we wrapped Rival, those friendships that I had were essentially over, and we just went our separate ways. And while losing those friendships definitely hurt, I walked away with a lesson that'll carry with me for the rest of my life. That lesson being that filmmaking is a job, and while it can be really, really fun at times, it should be taken seriously. And if the people around you don't respect your role in it, then they're not the right people to have on set. And to be clear, I'm not saying that friends are people that you can't work with. Honestly, some of my best friends are people that I met on that set. Not only were they incredibly fun, but they were some of the most professional people I've ever worked with in my life, and I would love to have the opportunity to work with them again. Well, almost everyone. Everyone except for that one person who ended up having homicidal tendencies, which leads me to the next part of this video, the real-life murder case. Even now, I still can't believe that this happened, because what do you mean that my lead actor that I hired to play the killer in my slasher movie turned out to actually be a killer in real life? Like, what do you mean? Of course there's more to it than that, but in that context, it just still feels absolutely surreal to me. I'm not gonna name names in this section, mostly because I don't want negative attention to be drawn on actual victims in this situation, but for people who really want to know, it's out there, and it's not gonna be hard to put two and two together. You can do your own internet sleuthing. Google is free. For some context, a few months after we wrapped Rival, the lead actor who I hired to play the killer in the movie actually ended up deciding to kill somebody on Halloween night, then hiding their body and then going on the run for over a month. What's even crazier to me is how I found out, because it was just a regular day and I had just sent the rough cut of the movie to one of the cast members through Instagram DMs, and they responded something along the lines of, "This looks great, I can't wait to see the rest of it. Also, your lead actor is wanted for murder." I'm not even kidding. And then right under that message, they sent me a link to the article. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. Like, I thought they were just fucking with me. But then when I opened the article, the headline read something along the lines of, "Have you seen this person?" And then it was zoomed in security footage of their face. I sat there staring at the screen, wondering if I was having like a fever dream. But then I went to reach out to this person through social media, and everything was wiped from their Instagram, their Facebook. Everything was gone except for their IMDb page. For weeks and weeks, news articles kept coming out about the situation, and more information started to be released. Soon after, he was arrested, which led to several months of me being contacted by private investigators and lawyers involved in the situation. And they were essentially all saying the same thing along the lines of, if I released the movie, legal action would be taken against me. Because ultimately what they were worried about was me profiting off of someone else's real life murder, which I was not looking to do that. I didn't want to be known as the dude who gained traction from his first movie because of a real life murder. Like, I wasn't about to do that. See, what the problem was, Rival was supposed to be released that January. That was literally right around the corner, which meant I had to scrap everything and just shelve the movie for the time being. But if I'm being honest, I was more than willing to do that, because the second that I got the first article, I stopped editing the movie entirely. I had no desire to continue editing it, at least until we got more information or I knew what was happening in the case. But more importantly, I didn't want to be insensitive and upset anyone who was actually victimized in this situation. For the next year or so leading up to the trial, I kept scrolling through the internet, reading what some people were saying, like in comments and stuff, and eventually it didn't take long for people to find his IMDb, and then that's when the conspiracy theory started. People began making connections that honestly weren't even there. Comments started popping up that named me and members of my cast and crew, saying that we groomed him into being a killer, which is just fucking stupid. We all know that's not how that works. But they basically made us responsible for his homicidal tendencies, which, it's a fucking movie. Like, he played a part. Was it well? Was he a little bit of a method actor? Maybe. But I take no responsibility for that. Honestly, I kind of had no idea what to do in that situation, and it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. So I did what every other chronically online gay man would do in the situation, and I turned to Reddit. I posted in the r/filmmakers forum, basically explaining my situation, not naming any names or certain aspects of the case so people wouldn't be able to figure out who I was talking about. But I don't know if you know this, but people on Reddit are really smart, and it didn't not take long for them to figure out who the fuck I was talking about. Most of the advice that I was receiving was from other filmmakers saying that I should document the situation. I was contacted by some of the biggest major studios who work with big time streaming companies that have made some of the most well-received Emmy-winning true crime documentaries there are out there. And they were all asking if they could use my story to make their own documentary, which at first I declined. The whole situation felt wrong. Like I said, it was just too soon. But then I started to remember the phone calls. I started to remember the threats. And for a moment, I got worried that everything I had invested in, all the money, all the time that I'd invested into Rival would have been taken away. And I started growing a little bit bitter. Not even a little bit bitter. I grew very bitter. And it led me to make one of the biggest regrets of my life that I can say now. I'm not exactly proud of this decision, but it ended up leading me to sign a holding agreement for this really, really big studio that contacted me. And even though I told myself that I didn't want to be the guy who profited off of this real life murder, I started justifying it a little bit. I was essentially telling myself, if I sign on to this documentary, it won't be as if I'm profiting off of it. I'll just be some guy telling a story about knowing a dude who murdered a dude, and I will be completely blameless in this, but like, we all know damn well that's not the truth. We all know there was something else that I was looking to gain out of it. And that holding agreement that I signed was valid for the duration of the year leading up to the trial of the murder. And you know what? Thankfully, nothing ever came from it. The studio wanted to see if anything would be revealed, if there were going to be any big revelations or any connections to my movie, you know, something that would make their documentary a lot more compelling. But thankfully that never happened. But it wasn't until right after I signed the contract that I started to actually realize the weight of the situation. Because at the end of the day, someone died. And I let my anger and my frustration take control of me, and the fact that I shelved the movie and my hard work, it made me turn into this person that I'm not exactly proud of. And I'm glad that nothing ever came from it. But the weight of the situation definitely got to me. And I just eventually grew sick of it. I wanted nothing to do with the movie, with filmmaking at all, really. So one day I sat at my computer and I opened the Rival project file, which I think I hadn't touched for like a year up until that point. And I decided to release the movie as it was, unfinished, unpolished, essentially a rough cut. I just let it out in the world. I just essentially wanted to get the movie out of my life. I wanted nothing to do with it anymore. But unfortunately, everything just went downhill from there. If you did not think it could get worse, you thought wrong. Because it was after I released the film that my life essentially started to fall apart. I became super sick and I was making frequent trips to the emergency room, which led me to not being able to hold a sustainable job, which led to me finding out that I have an autoimmune disease, which honestly ruined my life a lot more than anything else in this video. I'd stopped working, I had no source of income, and I turned into a severe alcoholic. I had essentially given up on myself. And yet, even in that time, as dark as it was, I had this itch to tell stories that never really went away. And the way to exercise those creative demons that I had in me, I ended up writing. I wrote a lot, actually. I actually ended up even writing a novel that isn't good, but it helped me get something out of my system. There was a moment in there where I even considered quitting film altogether and considered turning into an author to write novels, because at least that meant I wouldn't have to leave the house again. But it wasn't until recently, around November of 2024, that I revisited Rival for the first time. Honestly, I've never been super proud of that movie, or at least the version that was released online. Not just because of my negative emotions tied to it, but because it was something that I didn't put 100% of my effort into. And as I sat down and watched a clip from that movie, something happened. Something shifted in me. Funnily enough, it actually started when I physically cringed at one of the scenes that I was watching, where I went, I would never edit it that way today. I have no idea why I made it like that. So for several days, I worked on that scene, and I continued editing it into a version that I felt fully represented the way I would now. And when I watched it back, for the first time, I actually felt proud of my work, which is something that I had never felt while making this movie before. And little by little, over the next few months, oh my god. And And little by little, over the course of several months, I just kept going. I re-edited scene after scene, eventually shaping them into something that I felt represented the vision that I had 3 years ago when I filmed the movie. I started to realize what I was capable of. And that's when it happened. I fell in love with storytelling again. Most importantly, I fell in love with making movies again. Now, that's not to say this new movie is 100% perfect now that it fully represents my vision, because there are still flaws with it. You could still tell the footage was directed by a 19-year-old, but with the work that I did in post-production, I can confidently say that this movie is a version that I can actually be proud of, because I worked really hard on it. And as I went through the footage, I was reminded of something even more important than just this new cut. Despite all the drama and despite all the hurt associated with the movie, there were moments of pure joy on that set. Moments where we were just a group of people coming together and making something awesome, something that we can say we had a lot of fun working on. And that's why I feel this version deserves to be seen, because every single person who worked really hard on this project deserves to have a version that represents their hard work out there. So as of today, this new cut of Rival is available to watch on this YouTube channel, a version I've chosen not to monetize, and a version that truly reflects my love for filmmaking. And while the movie still isn't perfect, there were still so many lessons that I will plan on taking with me into my future projects, and for that I am incredibly grateful.